Harvey Bailey believed in rules. Not laws, rules. His rules. Never rob a bank on Monday when vaults are empty. Never work with men who drink before a job. Never hurt anyone unless they force your hand. And absolutely never, under any circumstances, talk to police. Bailey followed 3 of those rules religiously for 12 years across 29 bank robberies. The 4th one he broke exactly once, on December 18, 1922, when Federal Reserve Guard Charles Linton reached for his revolver. Bailey's shotgun went off, and for the next 57 years, until the day he died, Harvey Bailey had to live with a question. If you write your own rules, who judges when you break them? $200,000 vanished in 90 seconds outside the Denver Mint on a Monday morning in 1922, the first successful robbery of a United States mint in American history. Charles Linton became the only Federal Reserve Guard in the system's history to die in a robbery, a distinction that remains unique more than a century later. The gang escaped. Most died violently within a decade, but Harvey Bailey, the man witnesses placed at the trigger, walked free, robbed banks for 12 more years, and died at 91, having never been charged. This is the story of a man who believed he was different from common criminals, who thought meticulous planning could sanitize violence, who constructed a professional identity around robbery and convinced himself it was honest work. Harvey Bailey spent his life explaining why his robberies were somehow more ethical than others, why the violence that followed him wasn't really his fault, why he was an honest thief in a dishonest world. The question is whether he ever believed it himself. Denver, in 1922, sat at a strange intersection of Old West and modern city, a place where sheriffs who'd arrested Doc Holliday 40 years earlier now worked as Federal Reserve Guards, where bootleggers operated openly despite prohibition, where the Ku Klux Klan controlled city government. The Denver Mint had opened in 1896 to process gold and silver from Colorado's mining boom, and by 1922 it was producing millions of coins while housing one of the Federal Reserve's 12 regional branches. But the Federal Reserve Bank didn't have its own building yet. It operated from borrowed space inside the Mint, which meant cash transfers happened in plain sight on West Colfax Avenue, a busy downtown thoroughfare where anyone with patience could watch the patterns develop. Every Monday morning at 10:30 a.m., a Federal Reserve truck pulled up to collect the previous week's deposits. Always $200,000 in fresh $5 bills. Always the same 3 guards, always the same 2-minute window, while Mint officers carried the packages out. Harvey Bailey had worked as a railroad engineer in Iowa before the war, a job that required precision timing, route planning, and understanding how systems worked, skills that translated remarkably well to bank robbery once the economy collapsed and legitimate work dried up. He'd started with bootlegging in Chicago in 1920, running Canadian whiskey for gangs who valued reliability over flash. But bootlegging required loyalty to organizations, and Bailey preferred to work for himself. Bank robbery let him be an independent contractor. By 1922, he'd developed what he considered a professional reputation. He cased banks for weeks, mapped escape routes using county road maps, used multiple getaway cars, and maintained strict rules about violence that he believed separated him from thugs and killers. In interviews decades later, Bailey would insist he'd robbed 29 banks without seriously hurting anyone, that banks were insured so no real people lost money, that he only took what a corrupt system had already stolen from working people during the Depression. This narrative required ignoring several inconvenient facts, that the Depression wouldn't start for 7 more years when he began robbing banks, that guards and tellers traumatized by having shotguns pointed at them were real people, that meticulous planning doesn't make violence ethical. For the Denver job, Bailey assembled a crew in November 1922, men he'd worked with before, who understood his system and followed his rules about timing and execution. Nicholas Traynor, 36 years old, sometimes used the alias Chore Jimmy. He'd worked with Bailey on a bank robbery in Walnut Hills, Ohio 3 months earlier, and was known for being steady under pressure, the kind of man who didn't panic when things went wrong. Harold Burns, Frank McFarlane, who went by the Memphis Kid, and James Clark rounded out the crew, all experienced robbers with criminal records, all comfortable with violence, all operating under Bailey's planning and expecting his leadership to keep them out of prison. 2 women traveled with the gang, Florence Thompson, Traynor's common-law wife, and Margaret Burns, married to Harold. Police would later call them moles. But their exact role in the planning remains unclear, whether they were accomplices or simply caught in the gravitational pull of violent men. In late November, a well-dressed man started appearing at the Denver Public Library every afternoon, taking the same seat by a west-facing window with a clear view of the Mint 3 blocks away, spending hours watching through opera glasses disguised as reading. The librarian, Paula Kenny, found it odd enough to remember later how he never checked out books, never took notes, just watched the street with an intensity that suggested he was studying something more than architecture. This was Bailey's standard approach. Weeks of observation to establish guard routines, traffic patterns, police response times, escape route options. The kind of reconnaissance that let him tell himself he was a professional planner, not just a man preparing to point guns at people. On December 1st, someone rented a garage at 1631 Gilpin Street in Capitol Hill, 2 miles from the Mint, a private space where a black Buick touring car with drawn curtains could be stored without attracting attention from neighbors who might remember license plates. On November 25th, a license plate was stolen from a storekeeper's Hupmobile in Brighton, Colorado. A small detail that reveals planning beyond the robbery itself, preparation for pursuit, thinking 3 moves ahead about how police would try to track the getaway. Charles Linton had spent 26 years as an Arapahoe County deputy sheriff before joining the Federal Reserve Bank Guard service 4 years earlier. He'd been part of the team that arrested Doc Holliday on an Arizona warrant back in 1882, though political protection kept Holliday from ever being extradited. On the night of December 17, Linton told his wife he couldn't sleep, that he had what he called a premonition of a dire event, the kind of statement that seems insignificant until it becomes the last thing someone says before dying, when hindsight transforms ordinary worry into prophecy. December 18th, 1922, 8 a.m. The gang met at the Altahama Apartments on East Colfax and Lafayette Street in Capitol Hill. 5 men preparing for 90 seconds of violence that would define the rest of their lives, however long those lives lasted. At 7 p.m. the previous evening, they'd stolen a 1922 Buick touring car from outside a home on Grant Street. The owner's son had jumped on the running board trying to stop them, got a revolver shoved in his face, heard someone say, "This isn't your car, kid," and was pushed off as the Buick accelerated into darkness. At 9 a.m., witnesses saw 5 men leave the Altahama Apartments and get into the stolen Buick with its drawn curtains and replace license plates, sawed-off shotguns and revolvers hidden under coats. The final equipment check before a job Bailey had planned with his characteristic precision. At 9:30 a.m., Federal Reserve cashier Joseph Olson, guard Wilbert Havener, and a Treasury agent arrived at the Mint to coordinate the transfer. The same routine they'd followed every Monday for months. Predictability that Bailey's library surveillance had documented in meticulous detail. Havener and the Treasury agent returned to the Federal Reserve Office to collect 2 additional guards, John P. Adams and Charles Linton, before driving the armored truck back to the Mint for the actual cash pickup at 10:20 a.m. At 10:28 a.m., the Federal Reserve truck pulled up to the Mint entrance on West Colfax Avenue. 2 blocks east, the black Buick with drawn curtains began moving slowly toward the same location, timing calculated down to the minute Bailey had spent weeks observing. Charles Linton stepped out of the truck and opened the rear doors. 2 Mint officers emerged carrying packages wrapped in paper. $100,000 in each package, fresh $5 bills still smelling of ink. $200,000 total being transferred in broad daylight on a busy street. The packages went into the truck. The rear doors closed. The 2 Mint officers turned to walk back inside. In that moment, guards turning away, money secured, attention relaxing, the black Buick accelerated toward the curb. 10:30 a.m. The Buick pulled alongside the Federal Reserve truck on the left side. 2 men jumped out, taking cover behind telephone poles. One stayed behind the wheel. Harvey Bailey ran to the truck's rear. "Hands up." Charles Linton turned toward the voice. Bailey's shotgun fired. Buckshot hit Linton in the chest. He went down. The other guards dove for cover. Cashier Olson hit the sidewalk. Havener rolled under the truck, while a second robber smashed the truck's window with a shotgun butt and reached inside for the packages, hands grabbing paper-wrapped bundles worth more than most Denver workers earned in a decade. Inside the Mint, Superintendent Robert Grant heard the first shots and triggered the general alarm. Bells clanging throughout the building, 50 employees and guards grabbing rifles from racks, running toward windows facing Colfax Avenue, where they could see the robbery unfolding in real time. Windows opened on the second floor. Rifle barrels appeared. 50 Mint guards began firing at 4 robbers armed with shotguns and revolvers. Newspapers would later call it the wildest gun battle in Denver history. A 5-minute firefight that left 40 bullet holes in the Mint's transom and windows shattered across West Colfax. But Bailey had positioned the Buick on the truck's left side. The Federal Reserve vehicle acted as a shield against most of the incoming fire. Thick steel panels absorbing bullets that would have killed the robbers in seconds if they'd been exposed on the street. Money bags flew from the Federal Reserve truck into the Buick. 2 men working with practiced efficiency while bullets ricocheted off pavement and shattered storefront windows, while pedestrians dove for cover, while a waitress across the street at the Mint restaurant watched through the doorway and saw exactly how robbery becomes murder. 90 seconds since arrival. The money was loaded. Go. The driver hit the accelerator. The Buick lurched forward. 1 robber jumped onto the right side running board. As the Buick turned into the Civic Center half a block away, the man on the running board, later identified as Nicholas Traynor, turned back toward the Mint, raised his revolver, and emptied it at the guard still firing from windows. Mint guard Peter Kiedinger had grabbed a rifle when the shotgun fire started. He'd been waiting for a clear shot. The moment Traynor stood upright on that running board, silhouetted against the Buick's drawn curtains, Kiedinger fired. The rifle round hit Traynor in the jaw. Traynor swayed. Blood sprayed across the car's side. Hands reached out from inside the Buick, grabbed his coat, pulled him through the door as the vehicle accelerated east on Colfax, the getaway continuing with a mortally wounded man bleeding across the back seat. 5 minutes after the Buick first pulled up, West Colfax Avenue was silent except for alarm bells and the sounds of Charles Linton dying on the pavement. Buckshot wounds to the chest, beyond any help the other guards could provide. The only Federal Reserve officer who would ever die this way. Denver police threw roadblocks across every highway leaving the city within 30 minutes. Cars searched, license plates checked. Witnesses interviewed about a black Buick with drawn curtains, and at least one wounded man inside bleeding profusely from facial injuries. The investigation tracked the Buick from Omaha to Chicago to St. Paul. Following witness reports of men who matched descriptions, cars that resembled the getaway vehicle, blood trails that might indicate wounded robbers. But every lead evaporated before arrests could be made. Charles Linton's widow received a Federal Reserve death benefit of $5,000, compensation for 26 years as a deputy sheriff, and 4 years as a Federal Reserve guard, calculated down to a precise dollar amount that captured nothing about what it meant to lose a husband to a robbery that took 90 seconds. For 3 weeks, the black Buick simply vanished, not found on any highway, not spotted at any checkpoint, not abandoned in any parking lot or back alley. $200,000 and 5 robbers disappeared as if they'd driven into a void. January 14, 1923. A neighbor on Gilpin Street in Capitol Hill peered into a rented garage behind 1631 and saw something that made him call police. A black Buick touring car with a distinctive license plate number he'd seen in newspaper descriptions. Police opened the garage. The Buick was there, side splattered with dried blood. Slumped in the front seat was a frozen corpse. Nicholas Traynor, dead from the rifle shot that had caught him in the jaw on that running board. Left behind by associates who'd abandoned him rather than risk discovery. Inside the car, a fully loaded .30-30 Winchester rifle in the back seat, 2 shotguns, empty shell casings scattered on the floor, and weapons that could be traced to previous robberies. A mobile armory left behind because moving it would have drawn attention the gang couldn't afford. Traynor's face was destroyed by the rifle shot and winter decomposition, but fingerprints provided positive identification. A 36-year-old career criminal with a record stretching back to his 20s, recently released from Nebraska State Penitentiary, exactly the kind of man Bailey preferred for jobs requiring steady nerves. Police suspected Harvey Bailey immediately. Traynor and Bailey had worked together on the Walnut Hills bank robbery in Ohio 3 months before Denver. Both men's names appearing in witness statements, both known for meticulous planning and professional execution that supposedly minimized casualties. But Bailey had vanished from Denver in late December 1922, disappeared from police radar entirely, and would remain free for another 11 years, robbing banks across the Midwest while Charles Linton's widow raised 2 sons alone, while Denver police filed reports that went nowhere, while the money stayed gone. February 17, 1923. Secret Service agents raided an abandoned hideout in Minnesota and recovered $80,000 from the Denver robbery, 2/5 of the stolen money, bundled in packages that still smelled of mint ink, hidden in a basement alongside $73,000 in bonds from the Walnut Hills bank job that connected Traynor and Bailey months before Denver. Police believed the gang had fled to Minneapolis-St. Paul immediately after Denver and given the money to what they called a prominent Minneapolis attorney, a lawyer who allegedly kept $200,000 in stolen bills in his basement overnight before passing it to underworld contacts for laundering. Or $120,000 was never recovered, lost to history, spent on cars and apartments and bribes, or buried somewhere between Denver and Minneapolis by men who died before they could dig it up. Wealth that existed for 90 seconds and then evaporated into the criminal economy. Florence Thompson, Trainor's common-law wife, demanded to see his body in that Gilpin Street garage, told the gang she'd blow the whole case open, turn them all in, unless they let her say goodbye to the man shot on that running board trying to cover their escape. They took her to the garage. She bent over the frozen body and kissed his face, a moment witnessed by killers who knew they couldn't trust her, who understood she'd seen too much, who were already deciding what loyalty meant when survival was at stake. In 1927, 5 years after Denver, Florence Thompson's bullet-riddled body was found. Newspapers called her the Queen of the Mob, but she was really just a woman who'd loved the wrong man and known too many details about how Charles Linton died. In 1932, a decade after the robbery, Margaret Burns, Harold's wife, was found shot and burned in a wrecked car near Turtle Lake, Wisconsin. Her body barely identifiable. Another woman connected to Denver who died violently. Another loose end tied off by bullets. Harold Burns, dead. Frank McFarlane, the Memphis Kid, dead. Both killed in circumstances police never fully documented, but assumed were gang-related. Criminals eliminating each other over money or suspicion, or the paranoia that comes from knowing everyone you work with would murder you for the right price. Harvey Bailey, meanwhile, kept robbing banks, the Bank of Sturgis in Minnesota in 1928, the Bank of Wilmar in 1930, the Lincoln National Bank in Nebraska that same year for $2.7 million, the largest bank robbery in American history at that time. He maintained his system, county road maps for escape routes, weeks of surveillance, multiple getaway vehicles, strict rules about unnecessary violence, the same methodology that had failed to prevent Charles Linton's death, but succeeded in keeping Bailey free for over a decade. In his later autobiography, Bailey would frame himself as different from the violent gangsters of his era. He was a professional, he'd say, someone who planned rather than improvised, who valued precision over brutality, who took from institutions rather than individuals. This required an extraordinary capacity for selective memory, forgetting Linton's widow and 2 sons, forgetting the tellers who'd faced his shotgun, forgetting that institutions are just collections of people who suffer when their workplaces become crime scenes. June 1932. Harvey Bailey was arrested while playing golf on a Kansas City course, handcuffed between holes, driven to Kansas State Penitentiary at Lansing, sentenced to 30 years for the Fort Scott bank robbery, his decade of freedom ending on a putting green. June 1st, 1933. Bailey escaped during a prison baseball game. A wire around the warden's neck, a gun pressed to his back. The same planning skills applied to breaking out that he'd used for breaking in, proving competence has no inherent moral direction. August 12th, 1933. FBI agents raided a Texas farmhouse looking for Machine Gun Kelly, who'd kidnapped Oklahoma oil tycoon Charles Urschel. They found Harvey Bailey instead, recovering from a bullet wound in his leg, sleeping on a cot. Unaware Kelly was holding someone for ransom in another building on the same property. In Bailey's pocket, $500 from the Urschel ransom. Bills that Machine Gun Kelly's gang had given him for doctor bills, money marked and traceable. Physical evidence connecting him to a kidnapping he genuinely hadn't known was happening 20 yards away. October 7th, 1933. Harvey Bailey was sentenced to life in prison for complicity in the Urschel kidnapping. Convicted of a crime he hadn't committed because he'd been caught in the wrong hideout with the wrong money at the wrong moment. Ironic justice for a man who'd escaped actual justice for Denver and 28 other bank robberies. September 1st, 1934. Bailey was transferred to Alcatraz, the new federal supermax prison, on an island in San Francisco Bay designed to hold America's most dangerous criminals. The dean of American bank robbers sharing cells with Machine Gun Kelly, Al Capone, and others who'd built professional identities around violence. Bailey spent 12 years on Alcatraz, then returned to Leavenworth in 1946, transferred to Seagoville Minimum Security in 1960, and finally released March 30th, 1964, at age 76. 30 years total behind bars for crimes he did and didn't commit. December 2nd, 1934, 12 years after the Denver robbery, Police Chief Albert Clark announced the crime had been solved. 5 men and 2 women identified, most now dead through violence, the 2 survivors serving life sentences for unrelated crimes. But no one was ever charged with the Denver Mint robbery. Not Harvey Bailey, not James Oklahoma Jack Clark, not the estates of the dead gang members. The announcement solved nothing except the police department's need to close an embarrassing open file. The evidence was circumstantial. Witness descriptions recovered money, criminal associations, but nothing placing specific individuals at specific moments with specific weapons. Traynor was dead. The others were already serving life. Charles Linton's death would never get its day in court. Harvey Bailey walked out of Seagoville Federal Correctional Institution in March 1964, a free man for the first time in 31 years, released because he was old and sick and posed no threat to a society that had changed beyond recognition since the Depression. 2 years later, he married Mary Farmer, whose first husband, Defy Farmer, had been convicted for the Kansas City massacre. Bailey, at 78, finding companionship with another woman connected to Depression-era violence, building a quiet life in Missouri from the ruins of a criminal career. He found work as a woodworker at a cabinet company, hands that had held shotguns and county road maps now measuring cuts and sanding joints, the kind of honest labor he could have pursued at 20 instead of 30 bank robberies and 30 years in prison. Alternate timeline visible too late. In 1973, Bailey published his autobiography with Texas historian J. Evetts Haley, Robbing Banks Was My Business, a title that framed felony as profession, that positioned bank robbery as career choice rather than moral failure. One last attempt to control how history remembered him. He called himself an honest thief again, insisted he'd taken only from insured institutions, claimed he'd pulled 29 bank jobs without seriously hurting anyone, a statement that required forgetting December 18th, 1922, or redefining what serious hurt means when you're the one holding the shotgun. The book contained no apologies, no acknowledgement of victims, no reflection on Charles Linton or the terror experienced by people who'd faced his weapons. Just matter-of-fact descriptions of planning and execution, techniques and tactics, professional pride in criminal competence. March 1st, 1979. Harvey Bailey died in Missouri at age 91, 57 years after Denver, 46 years after his arrest, 15 years after release, having lived longer than any of his gang, longer than Charles Linton, longer than most bank robbers who followed his professional system. If you write your own rules, who judges when you break them? Bailey spent 57 years with that question. Did he have an answer, or did he just have justifications? The human mind has remarkable capacity for narrative construction. We tell ourselves stories about who we are, what our actions mean, why our choices were justified or necessary or different from similar choices made by worse people. Oh, Harvey Bailey believed he was a professional in a world of amateurs, an honest thief in a sea of dishonest ones, a man whose planning and precision somehow made violence more acceptable. And perhaps he died still believing it, having constructed a self-image so thorough it survived decades in prison and the weight of an unanswered question. Charles Linton died instantly from buckshot to the chest on December 18th, 1922. That's certain. The man who fired was following his own rules about when violence was justified. That's certain too. Whether he ever judged himself for breaking them, that remains unknown, and perhaps unknowable, even to himself. And that's where we'll leave it. Thanks for listening and diving into this incredible story. If you enjoyed this story and want more documentaries like this, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. And see you in the next one.